We have invited Sari today to... Why words? Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of SnarkSquad Pod, the media podcast where we discuss the serious undertones of our comedy. My name is Marinés.
My name is Nicole Sweeney.
And today we're joined by friend of the pod and regular Sari Riley. Sari, introduce yourself.
Hello. I didn't know I'm a regular, but I feel really special.
You are our most recurring guest at this point.
Ooh, that's very fancy. I hope I earned that spot.
Put it on your business card in your resume.
Yeah, SnarkSquad Pod.
Most recurring guest on a podcast.
Excellent. I just gotta keep watching Sam to make sure.
Yeah,
can I
she's
keep this
catching up.
line on? Yeah. Well, besides being a reoccurring guest here, I work on SciShow, the YouTube channel, and I'm an editorial assistant on Monstrous. I think those are the two big things that I do on the internet or in media.
We've invited Sari to join us today to talk about fan identity. We originally set this episode as being about fandoms, and I think we realized that was kind of broad. So we narrowed it down to fan identity. And I think that happened for a number of reasons. One is probably that Nicole's graduate studies and her thesis had a lot to do with this. So Nicole, I'll let you kind of talk about that.
This is my favorite topic to talk about all the time, always. I think, honestly, mostly it's the first thing, though, that fandom is just too broad. And I think that while all of these topical episodes deal with things that we could come back to a million times, fandom is still a little bit too much. But fan identity in particular is something that we had a really interesting conversation about on the Segway Magic vlogs a few years ago. And that is sort of a place that we kind of have on a list of somewhere that we can turn to for future podcast episode ideas, because we had a lot of really good conversations, I think, on the Segway Magic videos. But the fan identity conversation was really interesting to me, in part because it was one of the few times where I was like, you uploaded first, and I think at that point in time I wasn't really participating in the Segway Magic videos, but I saw yours and I was like, okay, I think you're wrong. I need to make a video to tell you why I think you're wrong. And so I don't know. But the prompt for those videos that we are kind of using as our jumping off point for this conversation, and then we'll eventually get into what I thought you were wrong about.
Sure.
The prompt for those videos was, what was the first fandom that you were a part of? And I think that's a good place to start a conversation about fandom identity.
I think that, yes, we're going to jump into this, but these videos, I want to be clear because I was wrong. But I was wrong about this in a conversation we had 3 years ago. So we made these videos, and I think even then we knew that this was kind of like an unfinished conversation. I'm not sure that we knew we would finish it 3 years later on a podcast, but that's what we're doing. And I think it's interesting because it has come up previously on other episodes of the podcast, particularly about Star Wars and being fans of that franchise and everything. So it really is coming full circle, not just because of your thesis and all that, but yes, let's answer this again. What was your first fandom?
So my first fandom, I had to think about this because I also have a weird relation to calling myself a fan and accepting that term. Which I'm sure I'll unpack in front of both of you in this podcast. So thinking back, it was probably Pokemon as a media entity, because I watched my dad play the games when I was really little, like the Game Boy original red, blue, or yellow. And it was the first instance when I can remember myself really loving a thing and experiencing it in a transmedia storytelling way, because Pokemon was this massive media phenomenon where there were the games, the video games you could play, the anime that you could watch. And I watched the English version of that. And there was a card game that I collected and bought, and there was like a bunch of other art stuff based on it. Like I think I got a computer game that was like Microsoft Paint, but just with Pokemon characters in it. And you could drag them around and make little stencils or like decorate things with the characters. And so it was the first instance of like a media property where I sought out more than just the original thing, which was the video game. I talked to other people about it. Like I would talk to anyone who would listen to me about Pokemon and how I was so excited about what was going on in the show, or like made friends based on it. And I also generated my own work based on it. So like I liked drawing as a kid, still like drawing now, but I drew fan art of Pokemon. I would like go in, try and trace them as best as possible or draw my own. And so those fanish behaviors, even though I wouldn't describe them at the time because I didn't have the language for it, was definitely like I was a little fan. And
so these are all the hallmarks of fandom behavior.
Yeah, I loved a thing so much that I did all these things. And so I would say that probably first fandom, the thing that I threw myself into in many fanish ways.
Yeah, that's like a really broad spectrum of fan participation too in that first thing, which is really interesting. I don't know that there's anything that I feel like I covered all the bases quite so thoroughly in that way. So my like early fandom participation was largely music related. I spent a lot of time making websites and participating in forums and stuff. The first thing like this that I did, though, was Spice Girls. My very first website when I was 8 or 9, maybe. I made an Angel Fire website called Nikki's Cool Spice Site. And it was pictures of the Spice Girls that I found around the internet. And like, well, you know, my dad showed me how to view the source code. And so I basically just stole a lot of things around the internet and pasted them onto my Angel Fire website. And I spent a lot of time on like other Spice Girls websites and stuff. And yeah, so the Spice Girls were I think my first like major bit of commitment. Also an honorable but significant mention. When I was a freshman in high school, I spent a shit ton of time in the Good Charlotte message boards. And I don't remember why, but they closed down the message boards over, like there was some massive drama, like something happened that I'm sure when I was 14, I could have detailed for you like what went down on the forums that caused them to close down the Good Charlotte forums. But like all of the people in the Good Charlotte forums at that time sort of scattered, and I just like made a message board that became this music, like this like larger sort of music fan website. And I basically like in the fallout from that made a forum that was kind of like general music of that sort. And that was like where my teenage fandom activity existed. So for me, it was more like community based, I guess, than art creation, if that makes sense in terms. I think that is more how I would describe my fandom participation.
I don't know how to answer this question without unpacking my issues, like with identifying as a fan. And I know that will come as we keep talking, but I kind of have to front load it because I grew up in a very strict religious household that was incredibly counterculture. And I just didn't have, and I mean, we were first generation American. So there were so many things working against me being in the know of any kind of pop culture to be in a fandom. And just the way that our mother raised us was very like anti-fan-ish, just in the sense that it was like, you know, we were fans of Jesus basically, and nothing else. Like there wasn't room to
you're
be
part of a really old school fandom,
right.
basically.
If I think about it, my first fandom was Jesus, so that's kind of where I started. So I don't think that I I, like Sari said, and I love the way that you said it, like I didn't have the vocabulary, and I didn't, even dating like 3 years back, it was very difficult for me to kind of place myself in any fandom. But I have to say that my first one was probably Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because it's the recaps that we started. I really enjoyed the media for the most part. I was engaging with other fans, and it's become like a big thing in my life, and I remember the media and more than just like watching it, but you know, it was very, very involved, and I still consider myself a fan of Buffy. So I think it was the first fandom that I participated in, and you know, and encountered other fans and had that kind of interaction. While Sari was talking though, it made me think of another like honorable mention that I don't know. I think it maybe qualifies, but like Neopets back in the early 2000s.
Oh my God.
Ooh.
Yes.
So I don't know. I don't know if it qualifies. I mean, it does, because I had this Neopet. I was interacting with other fans all the time. I was creating all this stuff around my Neopet, like stories and caption contests and all this stuff. Like I wouldn't ever consider myself a fan of it at that moment, but like, did I dedicate some time and some effort into that whole world? Absolutely.
That is a really interesting one, because I think that there is sort of a fuzzy line that maybe exists, or I guess I'm this is a question to you guys, whether you think that it is possible to have just played Neopets the game without also being like a fan of it. Like where how would you make that distinction? Because based on that, Sari and I both reacted, so we all have context for Neopets. I'm assuming. Yes. Okay.
And I think that's a really interesting question, because I would consider myself as having played Neopets but not being a fan of it.
Okay.
Because I didn't participate beyond the base game. I had my Neopet. I gamed the heck out of the money tree, and so I would like get as much free stuff as possible. Like multiple accounts to do that. Not always, like a little some shady business. But I never interacted with anyone else on the site. Like me playing Neopets was such an isolated experience. I never participated in any competitions. I never bought anything from anyone else's stores, like not even that level of interaction. The only sort of fanish behaviors that I probably did was like reading about ways to gamify my day so I could like maximize the Neo points I got. And so like reading what other people had written about Neopets, but like I never posted on message boards, so I didn't have the community aspect of it. So I think I played Neopets, but was not part of the Neopets fandom.
And that would be, I think, the line that I was going to say as well. I think that because Neopets was made up of all of these smaller games that you could play in isolation, basically. Like if you were logging on and just going and playing the games, then that's not really participating in the fandom. You're just using, I don't know, you're just playing the games by yourself. So I definitely like posted on the message boards and interacted with people and read blogs about Neopets and how to maximize the money and all that stuff too. Like I definitely was interacting, caption contests, and I had my own store and I would buy in other people's store. So it was very involved for me, I think, in a way that I'm not like 100% there in calling it my first fandom, but I think it's an honorable. I think it's an honorable mention. I think that it really taught me or showed me how I could be involved with online communities in a way that I don't think anything else had up to that point.
Yeah, that's just such a good one. That's in between my Spice Girls and my Good Charlotte fandom. There's
on the timeline.
I also co-sign on Neopets as an important fandom moment. Yeah, because like the guilds, there were so many things about the site that facilitated like a level of participation beyond just playing the game. And yes, I agree. I definitely think there is a line between playing the game versus being part of the fandom. I think though, and this is like to tie this back to the larger conversation and not just talk about Neopets for an hour, which is fine too, but
it's a different episode
podcast, right? Like that's what you invited me on for.
Now on, this is the Neopets podcast. Yeah. I think separate from this question, though, of like how much were you in, like whether or not you engaged in the fandom in any way, is a question of like whether or not you can consider yourself a fan of a thing. And I think it is possible to have not participated in the fandom in any meaningful way, but still like, yeah, this was a thing that I was a fan of. Like, this is a thing that I spent like dedicated many hours of my life to. It's a piece of media that lots of people who maybe didn't participate in the fandom, but like had what it sounds like Sari's rough level of participation was. I don't know that is, I think that that's like an individual question. You can decide for yourself, but I think that can still constitute like fan identity. But it's interesting because Mari mentioned at the beginning that like this came up when we were talking about Star Wars, right? And so like it gets tricky with stuff like that where, so I have now watched and enjoyed 2 whole Star Wars movies. And I definitely enjoyed both of those movies. But like, because of everything that franchise is, it's like, I cannot say that I am a Star Wars. I would not personally choose to say that I am a Star Wars fan. I might say I am a fan of these 2 movies, but I certainly would not say that I am a Star Wars fan. But I think that to me is a little bit to do with the media itself and mostly a question of like existing fandom and like existing cultural stuff surrounding it. Comics are something that seem kind of related to this. I do not know what I'm talking about, so I'm like bringing this up to kick this back to you guys because both of you know more about this than I do. But like as a thing where, a comic can have been in existence for many, many years, and at some point like you just enter into it and that seems to be a thing that is acceptable to do in a way that like Star Wars does not seem like something for which it is acceptable to do, if that makes sense.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up comics because I would
disagree.
Yeah, I would say that they're like the feeling that I get around Star Wars and the feeling that I get around comics, especially if you get into like Marvel and DC, there's a similar level of gatekeeping around all of those media properties where there are people who have been like OG fans and are really defensive about other people taking on that title, which for the record, I think is bullshit. Like I hate gatekeeping with a fiery passion and I wish I could like smash all the barriers to entry to all fandoms. But yeah, in a similar way, I think it should be easy for people to jump in, especially with all the reboots, especially with all like the different takes on different characters. And it's so hard for people to have consumed all of, like, for example, all of The Flash. There have been so many iterations written by so many people that no one or very few people probably have an encyclopedic knowledge of the whole history. But there's still a lot of like weirdness around fan identity and people being able to call themselves fans and people being accepted into the fandom.
I think the key here is really history. And I think any franchise or media or anything that has history has that piece of gatekeeping where if you're entering in more recently into the fandom, there's that sense of like, well, you don't know anything. You weren't here from the beginning. Did you watch all of this backlog and all of the catalog of things that you need to watch to be a fan? And I think that that's where the gatekeeping comes from. When there is a history to things like that, I don't know if that's just like, and that's what worries me. That's like what kind of like, I'm always hesitant to be like, am I a fan of this because of that gatekeeping and that sense of like having to be in on the ground floor, which very few people are, but they like to assert themselves. Like, did you read the Game of Thrones books before you watched the TV show? Are you a real fan? Because there's history there. Or the Ghostbusters remake. Like, if you're a fan of like the reboot, like, are you a real fan? Because there was the 80s version that everybody loved so much. And I think it all is tied to history.
So I think what I'm actually getting at here is that there's something like distinct in the case of Star Wars, because like I'm aware of all of these like gatekeeping examples. And so I guess there's like a separate question around whether or not gatekeepers exist and like whether or not you as an individual, like, I don't know, independent of the gatekeepers, like can identify as a fan at a certain point. Like to me, so the Game of Thrones example, like I think yes, I'm sure there are tons of book readers who'd be like, well, who would potentially try to gatekeep that. But like, also it seems perfectly valid and legitimate to me to say like, yeah, I love the show. I'm a fan of the show. Like long before we started reading the books, I think it is very safe to say that we were both active participants in the TV show's fandom, like because we were recapping it, we were like live tweeting it, like, we were engaging in the fandom in some meaningful ways. And so without having read the books, I don't know, like, I guess like this history question, I don't like, now I just like can't get over this Star Wars thing because I feel like this gatekeeper thing still isn't quite getting at what I was asking, I guess, because like, even though I enjoyed these two Star Wars movies, like there are pieces of it that are fundamentally not connecting with me, as we talked about in both of our podcast episodes about these movies. Like there are pieces that are fundamentally not connecting with me because I do not have the history, whereas something that is like a rebooted version of something, like I have no comic experience, like no experience with Marvel comics, but like not having that experience doesn't detract from my ability to enjoy those movies. Like those are new things. And so I don't know, that feels different.
Is it more like you don't feel a desire to like participate in the fandom? That is, I don't know if that's exactly, because like you can be a fan of those two Star Wars movies, but you don't have the additional desire to like talk about them with a bunch of people or learn more about the extended universe or go back and watch the original 6. Is that?
No, I think it's just that I'm not a fan of those two movies. I think I just like them and I'm not really a fan. Never mind. I can't. I give up.
Well, because I think that is where the term gets blurry for me. So I guess I was asking a very leading question to get at my own anxieties about calling myself a fan. Like, do you feel this way too? Let me describe a very specific feeling. Just say yes or no. Because I think that's how I feel, especially, so like describing Pokemon as my first fandom, that was probably like the most quote unquote involved in a fandom I've ever been. I like lurk a lot in fan communities, but I very infrequently actually participate in discussions or generate work in a public manner. Like every time I've drawn fan art, it's just been like for myself, pretty much. And so I am more comfortable at this point in my life, like after having studied fans and fan cultures academically, I'm like, yeah, I can call myself a fan of like a fan of Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, a fan of the Game of Thrones, the TV show, a fan of the Persona video game series. But where I draw the line and start getting uncomfortable and unsure of myself, whether or not to say I'm in a fandom, is because I don't participate in those things, and because sometimes I'm happy just consuming the piece of work, and I'll talk to people about it if they want to, but I don't feel the need or the desire to like jump online and start talking to people about it or seeking out those community spaces and participate. I'm just like happy thinking about it, thinking about how the media has changed me and processing it independently of anyone else, which feels like a cornerstone in my idea of what fandom is and what that part of fan identity is.
Mm-hmm.
I'm internalizing all of this because on the opposite end of that, I think there's so many different like variables here, and I think we've touched on like number one, do you want to be a fan? Like that's like very key. Yeah. Like, do you want to be a fan of this piece of media? Like yes or no. And then like number two, so you're talking about like how you consume media and how a lot of times it's very like just you and yourself in the story, and so engagement comes up here and how much of that is a piece of the definition of fandom. And it's tricky for me because I'm completely a person that everything that I read and watch and take in, I want to discuss, regardless of it, whether I liked it or didn't like it. It's just, I love to pick apart media and consume it with others and really discuss it. So drawing the lines for me then becomes complicated on the other end, where I engage with people who also consume the different media than I do all the time. So it's really leaning back for me on the like side of like, okay, but do you want to be a part of this fandom? Or do you consider yourself a fan? Because if I were just to base my definition on engagement, like I engage with everything. So we have nearly like the opposite kind of perceptions and problems in that regard, I would say, which is really interesting to me because in everybody's own personal definition of the fandoms that they participate in or what a fan is that balance of like enjoyment and engagement.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that we have such opposite opinions because I think the definition of fan is inherently very personal. As much as people try and define it academically, there are so many different versions of it because it's based on everyone's individual experience interacting with media, which is weird and cool and fun and also frustrating when you're trying to define it for yourself.
And everybody, when you're trying to define it for yourself, especially in an academic context, like, well, we have to read an entire chapter of every fucking book that I'm using is dedicated to this question of how they're going to define this word. And it's very interesting to read. But then when it comes time to like use that information, just like, well, shit. So this question of like engaging with and like being critical of it, I think is another thing that I would like to bring up. I think that is like at the heart of our 3-year-old disagreement, but like that was the thing that I kind of latched on to because I think that there's like a fairly common perception of like fan participation as somehow being mutually exclusive to being a critical consumer. And I think I don't think either of you are going to like argue in favor of that perspective right now. But I think like that is something that I think that comes up a lot when people are trying to assess for themselves their sense of their like fan identification. I think that like this idea that, oh, if I'm a fan of a thing, then that somehow means that I can't also engage with it earnestly and critically. I also think that that's true of a lot of like just emotionally loaded words in general. Like I think like fan and nostalgia and like there are a lot of words like that I think that people take as like because there is emotion involved, you cannot have like a rational perspective on a thing also, which I think is stupid and wrong. But there's my very nuanced take on that. But I think that is like also a thing that comes into these conversations too. Is like I think that especially in the case of, you know, what we do, what Snark Squad is and always has been is, you know, this really like engaging with media and picking it apart. And I think that also kind of becomes tricky. It's like where do you draw the line?
I think there's a separate thing here of like knowing and getting to know that you can be a fan of something and still be critical of it and still recognize where it maybe wasn't the strongest or all of those things. You can be critical of something that you love and that you are a fan of. I think the opposite or the part where it becomes more personal, and I think maybe this is what I was getting at and I didn't verbalize it well, I didn't express it well, but being a critical person, a hypercritical person, means that I don't often enjoy things enough that I can consider myself fans of them, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like there's a personality that is like very open to enjoying media, and that might give way to somebody who can more easily pass that first barrier of, did you enjoy this enough to want to be a fan? Where I rarely get there because I'm just like, you know, like I did not enjoy this enough to want to be called a fan. So that's like my first own personal barrier to entry into fandoms, is that I need to enjoy a piece of something so much that I want to further engage in a way that I think is above and beyond how I want to engage with most other media. And that's kind of like my own level of like entering into fandom, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That is so relatable. You just described like my brain to me that I didn't realize was what I was thinking. But that is 100% a barrier to entry for me too. Because especially like having studied media and having like, I do think about media a lot, even if I don't discuss it with other people. So that's a difference between us. But I have the exact same thing where even just watching it in isolation by myself, I deconstruct stories or critique them in such a way that I don't have the just like heart swelling, unabashed love of a lot of things, or I have to check myself and be like, oh, this is a stronger feeling than normal when I watch or play or read a thing.
So, but here's the thing. Heart-swelling, unabashed love, this, like, that still comes back to what I'm saying about, like, the idea of, like, fandom as somehow being mutually exclusive from like critical consumption. Like there are a ton of fandom spaces where much of the sort of fandom community is like centered around the picking apart of a thing. There's a lot of like fanfic that is dedicated to this idea of like basically correcting canon. Like the story is wrong or broken in some way. Like some character was badly written or whatever. And so like the fandom is going to do the work of fixing it. Or like, I don't know, this is a thing that we encountered a lot on SnarkSquad, you know, with characters that we didn't like, that like the fandom dedicated a lot of energy to kind of reconstructing the character. I don't know. I think like I get what you're saying, and like I understand. So I think that even those people, let's say like with Buffy, who took all of this time and effort to like reimagine who Wesley was as a character, I think that came from a place of enjoying him so much that they were then doing we always said this, you're doing the heavy lifting for the writers. That's not what the writers put into it, but you are coming from a place of where you now want to insert this additional energy into this thing that you enjoy to make it better for yourself. And not that that's wrong, but I think that's what Sari and I are saying, is that like initial barrier to entry is that like first enjoyment. Not that you can't be critical of it as well or after, but it's like that first barrier of like, did I even enjoy this enough to want to put that energy or to continue engaging with it, even if it is to pick it apart in a way that is, you know, deconstructing or making it better or AU. So I don't know, when you're like a person that doesn't often enjoy media to that level, not that, I mean, I still enjoy consuming media, but there's not a lot of times where I'm like, wow, I enjoyed that so much that I now want to go find Tumblr gift sets about it and read some fan fiction and engage with other fans or whatever it is that your personal definition of fandom is. Like a lot of times the end of my interaction with a piece of media is a review, and that's kind of it. Right. So, okay, this is the thing. To me, I don't think that levels is necessarily universally applicable in this case. Like, I think that like this is a way of engaging with media that is separate from the conversation of how much you enjoyed a thing. There are spaces that are dedicated to community media creation, consumption, whatever, like that are like in those spaces where the media itself isn't necessarily doesn't really actually matter that much in the end. Like, I don't think, like, I think that there are people who participate in fandoms because of those communities themselves, more so than like an extreme level of like or dislike for a thing. I think like I understand why that level thing is a barrier to entry for you, like that makes perfect sense to me. But I still don't think that level of enjoyment is inherently a thing, like definitionally of this is fandom or this is not.
Right. So it is definitely like a personal, that, like I said, that's like a first for me personally, that's like my first level of like, okay, will I enter into a fandom? And I think it does differ with people because it might be for you like, okay, I know this fandom and I want to engage with it, or I consume this thing and I want to contribute to it, or like everybody's reason for entering into a fandom is different. And I think my first, like making this personal, my first inclination is based on how much did I enjoy this and how much do I want to keep engaging with it. But that's not universal.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important thing to keep clarifying because of the way fandoms and being a fan is perceived. Generally, like we're all people who are very well versed in the language of media and like watching things, talking about them, things like that. But I think I'm glad that you keep pushing this, Nicole, and like pushing us to better define this because like there has been, especially in recent times, a conflation of just like quote unquote geek culture and being a fan. So like the idea of fan and fandom is applied to a very narrow range of culture of like people who love a thing and are really passionate about it, and like the screaming fangirl trope, or trope is not the right word, like stereotype.
Yeah.
The broader word for trope in the real world.
In the real world.
In the real world, we call those stereotypes.
Tropes, but in life.
And so that's like, I feel like the mental image, and even like sports fans, can't neglect those, like screaming sports fans or things like that, where it's people who really, really love a thing to the point of not seeing its flaws. And so like, because that stereotype exists, it's important to work in this nuance and be like, well, yeah, you can be critical of the things you love. And fandom is a broad collection, and fan identity is like a collection of communities and behaviors and different fanish practices, independent of whether or not you like the source material. And so it's like a very complicated thing that, I don't know, that people might not know that they participate in because they get hung up on the, do you love a thing? Yes, no. But I also find the, do I like a thing, a useful metric for my own, like, am I a fan of this thing? Because I think about media, like so much media, beyond the things that I would consider myself a fan of.
I think another piece of like this whole being critical and how that works into your own fan identity and being part of a fandom, like I can, making this personal, stand here all day long and like from a very like critical and like soapboxy kind of place be like, yes, you can be critical of the things that you're a fan of. But I also know that when your emotions get engaged in a piece of media to a certain level, it becomes incredibly difficult. And I've had experiences like that. And I've been reading, for an example, Pride and Prejudice since I was 14, and I read it at least once a year. And it's to the point that I love this piece of media so much that I don't know that I can be critical of it because it's very difficult at this point to separate my years of experience with it from my love of it and like step back and like look at it with a critical eye. That's very difficult for me. So while I know that it is possible to have that separation between the media, the thing you love, and your emotions, I can also recognize that for people who are fans and who dedicate time and years into a piece of media, those lines become incredibly blurry. So it's very difficult to like see like what are the shortcomings of this thing that has shaped my life in a very meaningful way. Like I don't know anymore.
And how might it reflect on me being defective as a human being?
Right.
Yeah.
This is like one of those episodes of the podcast that I really hope is like turning out well, because it's giving me anxiety to have this conversation because I keep like having points of disagreement, and like it's so stressful when it's happening. We've talked about this on Twitter that like the experience of disagreeing with each other while we record is very stressful, but usually I'm happy when I listen to it back and I'm like reminding myself
it'll be fine. It'll be fine.
Yeah. As I'm talking, I'm like anxious about every word coming out of my mouth because it's like, oh, should I have said that differently? Is this really my opinion? I don't even know anymore. more.
We're actually going to scrap this whole episode.
But I think that to this question of like being in your feelings about a piece of media, this is a like broader, even beyond conversations about media, just thing that I have, I don't know, an opinion that I hold quite dear, I guess, is that I sort of reject the idea that like there is this valorized ideal of like being hyper rational and like free of emotion and like that kind of objectivity as like the pinnacle way of like how you talk about a thing. And I think that is also part of what I'm getting at when I keep like circling back around these points of like you can love the thing and be critical of it and blah, 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 whatever. But like it is related to that like larger feeling that I have that like, I think that if you think that you are so like magically gifted at like not having emotions when talking about things, like
that's called being a psychopath.
Right? I don't know. Like there is just something about that in discourse that I find it so frustrating in just all sorts of discourse. And I think, but like, I also think it applies here too. And so I think that like, it's something that, you know, we come back to in all of these media conversations. It's the reason we start all the conversations with like, did you like this? The question isn't, is it good? It's, did you like this?
Right.
Because like, and because I think the question of, is it good is ultimately kind of a stupid question. Like, I think
incredibly subjective. Like,
yes, exactly. Like, did you like this? And so like this question to this point of, you know, like, can you divorce your feelings and your attachment? Like, probably sort of like, no, in the case of Pride and Prejudice, you probably can't. But like that to me seems fine. Like I don't like there's no problem with that to me. Like that seems like a perfectly fine way to engage with and around a piece of media. And I think when talking about this, I am wary of anything that feels like it is creating a hierarchy in which emotions are less than somehow, because like so much of what I think is great about media is that it is like the kinds of stories that we talk about, at least here on this podcast, are, you know, like that at their best, they are facilitating emotions. Like that's a big part of what they're doing. So I don't know.
I thank you for clarifying, because as much as I call myself a critical person, I always say about media too that I always jump in feelings first. Like I have all of the feelings all of the time about media. And so I'm not saying that I divorce that from any piece of media that I go into. I'm like crying, laughing, hating, anger, like feelings all the time when it's me in media. I think it comes to sometimes a point where something means so much to me that it just becomes difficult to see it objectively in any sort of way, or even, I don't know, it becomes so entangled with memories and feelings and experiences that it almost ceases to exist as a separate entity, as this piece of media. It becomes, I mean, it's been with me half my life, this particular piece of media. So when people are talking about, oh, it's like boring in this part, or it's slow, and like that, I can't process it. Like I can't, you know, so I totally get where that comes in with fandom, where I think that that's where the conversation starts about being critical of the things that you love, because, you know, people like me have found it difficult in the past to really separate the media from the experience. And I think, you know, that's where I'm getting at. But yes, I totally approach everything that I watch and read feelings first. I approach life feelings first. So I don't know how to do it any other way.
Yeah. Well, I think that like everything that you just said is an important part of discussions around fandom to me, because I trained myself out of this, but I went through a bad or like high school period of my life where I was like, I'm the science person. I'm going to be super rational. Emotions are bullshit, which I've since socialized myself to be like, no, this is okay. You can feel things. Like, you're allowed to cry. This is fine. But I think that the most productive discussions in and around fandom involve people acknowledging where their emotions are and where their biases are and things like that. So I love when people love things. I love when people have strong emotional reactions to it. And I think I agree with what both of you are saying about like the beauty and the joy and the feelings about media is such a good and powerful thing. And I think it's even better when people can like talk about those feelings that they're experiencing and where they're coming from and going beyond like, this is sounding hierarchical. You can just love a thing. You can just watch and enjoy a thing and not think about it other than the 30 minutes you're sitting down and watching a TV show. You can call yourself a fan. Love it. Great. A+. I like participating in conversations where people also go one step beyond that and think about like, why did I have this emotional experience with this thing, and trying to understand where other people had their different emotional experiences with a thing. And I guess that sounds kind of like adding rationality to emotions to make it more palatable. But also I think it just makes it more interesting to like understand why we feel the things that we feel and also feel them just as strongly, but acknowledging our biases and our personal differences.
Yes. Yes, that is like a big part of what I was getting at. And I think that, like framing it as, yes, blending emotions and rationale, like whatever, like however you want to, that's like fine to me. But I think that to me is like the heart of my things that both in these media conversations and in like larger sort of like political, whatever, but like this idea that your sort of lived experience as a human being is also like a valid data point in the conversation. Like that it's not a separate thread, that like that it is part of it, that this story did this thing and used these devices to do it. And also I read it at this time in my life. Like, and that is the totality of the thing for you. And like, maybe it won't be the totality of the thing for other people because they didn't consume that story at that time in their life. But like, I don't think that means that you need to subtract that piece of it, like, or that it is any less, or that it is somehow removed or part of a separate piece of the conversation. Like, I think that what is so interesting about these conversations is the way that those like personal experiences kind of overlap or butt against each other or whatever. Like, 'cause we all saw the thing or consumed the story or whatever, but like what makes discussing it interesting is often part of that like lived experience that you are bringing to the table when you consume and subsequently discuss a piece of media. I'm like looking forward to listening back to this episode in 3 years and being like, wow, I was wrong then too. I think as I'm listening to you, Nicole, like talk about these things and challenge us and really kind of work around where we're coming from here, it really strikes me how much I still feel like I don't have the vocabulary to really talk about fandoms because I was so late into even reaching a place where I felt like I could, and because fandoms were so not a formative thing for me. And it's frustrating for me because I love words and I love analyzing things. And I just feel like I don't have a grasp on this and I don't have the vocabulary to really talk about it. And you said something earlier that I wanted to bring up, and it was, do gatekeepers exist, or is that something like, I feel like I'm gatekeeping myself at this point. Which I will say that 100% gatekeepers exist. Like, I think that they're out there in the fandoms, and I think that is especially true as being a woman in any kind of fandom that can be considered nerdy or geeky or anything like that. Gatekeepers are out there, but I think a lot of it
it is too very involved in what your idea of a fandom is and the value that you put on what fandom can be, that, I mean, a lot of times I feel like I'm self-selecting out. And I saw it very much in that video. And even as I'm trying to explain like where I'm coming from, I'm like, I'm doing it again.
I mean, I don't know how much of there is here for you to come back to 3 years later and say I was wrong. But I do think that this point of vocabulary is very, very interesting. And I think like going back to the point that I have spent the last half an hour making and again about like the degree to which lived experience ultimately plays a role. Like this is something where you and I are coming at it from like the most divergent places of like anything that we have talked about on the podcast. Like, again, because so much of my adolescence was spent in internet fandom spaces. Like the word fandom didn't enter my life until I was an adult, but like, it is very clear to me and easy for me to look back at that and say, yeah, like I was doing fandom things when I was a kid. And then also I spent several years literally just reading books and thinking about it. So like there's a whole other level of like, yes, I spent a lot of time not only thinking about fandom, but reading lots of other people who also spent a lot of time thinking about fandom. So I just have too many feelings about this also. This is also a thing where my lived experience leaves me with a lot of emotions that I cannot divorce from this conversation. So, take that as you will.
Well, it's also really interesting because I feel like I've been flip-flopping a lot within this conversation and am also halfway between both of your lived experiences. So it's like I grew up being a fan of things. Like my dad was very encouraging of whatever weird interest I wanted to pursue, but I never participated. I lurked, if anything, but barely was not an internet person at all. We had a shared family computer, so I just didn't have access to online cultures and online communities until I was much older, like late high school. But then I got to college and I took classes about being a fan, like a couple of them, and interned under someone who does fan studies for a living and things like that. And so I went from being within myself and consuming a lot of media to kind of dabbling in it academically, but then just to the extent of a couple classes in undergrad, and then my interests scattered as they do. And so now I have these mixed opinions where it's like, I know how to say some of these big words and I have this term, but I don't have this amount of lived experience. So I have to base it on what I perceive other people's fan experiences to be. And it's all a mess. I don't know. So I have a lot of feelings, but I don't know where they come from. I think is the problem.
Also in life, like in this podcast, but like in general, same.
I want to give, not a shout out. That would be weird to say, but I just want to, talking about like lived experiences and coming to fandoms, I mentioned this in the beginning, but I think a lot of it too is, and with online spaces in general, especially like during my formative years and whatnot, I mentioned being a first generation American. And I think a lot of times too, it became difficult for me to see myself in fandoms because I never saw myself represented in fandoms. And so even to this day, like it can be difficult to enter spaces where you don't necessarily see yourself represented. And so I think there was a lot of that too, where I felt so apart from being a fan that it's very difficult to form that idea of myself and that identity of myself as like a 31-year-old woman, just to start like introducing this to my like idea of myself. Not impossible, but it is something that like you see that I'm like circling around, like, I don't know, am I a fan of things? So my lived experience was just, it's so difficult coming from that area to really find myself, see myself, and feel comfortable in online spaces as a woman of color and like be like, yeah, cool, this is totally fine, and I have no negative experiences here, because that's just not the truth either. So
yeah, and I think it's interesting also you talking about that because my mom is from Malaysia, so I'm like half from a first generation immigrant family. But I am super white passing. My dad was the primary caregiver as I was growing up. So like a lot of my being raised was immersed in whiteness and immersed in like being part of the dominant culture. And so it's entirely possible now. You saying, describing your experience has made me think I rode the wave of privilege also as a youth in many ways, but also in the case of fandom where like my mom wasn't interested in critically discussing media or anything, or like was disconnected from my fanish interests. But because I had my dad and that part of the family and that part of like being represented, at least like in appearance in media and things like that, there were fewer barriers to me being in fan spaces and calling myself a fan of things. Possibly. I don't know. It's all complicated.
This is just can't. I don't know. This popped into my head as I was talking about that, and we are talking about like approaching fandoms in different aspects, but it brought a memory to me about like the first time I really saw Latin American, Hispanic people being fans of things in a way that I just realized left an impression on me. And it's really, really weird because it was around the death of a singer. And so it was Selena in the early 90s. And I remember watching that news break. And I remember my parents being very affected by it. And then everything that happened in the aftermath of her death. And it was like such an outpouring of love, such a renewed interest in her life, in her music, and like seeing, you know, that the Latin American community kind of come around this person that made me really aware that there was like, I didn't have the word then and just kind of realizing this now, but like fandom outside of what was like American and Western and that kind of whole thing. So I think that talking about this brought that to my memory, but just kind of thinking about the things that were present in my life. So, you know, bachata music and things that were very un-American that I've never put into the context of like being fan or seeing my parents be a fan of, because I just have such an American view of what that consists of. Even because I grew up here as well, you know? So I don't know. It's a lot to unpack.
Yup.
Also applied to all of life. A lot to unpack constantly.
A lot to unpack.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we did an episode, but did we?
Yeah, I don't know. This is not. You'll probably cut this, but I feel like I feel like I've said a lot of things in this episode, and I feel like I've learned some things. I don't feel like I've moved in any direction necessarily. I just have more things to think about now.
More things to unpack.
Yeah, that seems legit. Okay, so we're clearly winding down. I have one more question that is like opening a new thread, but I think it's going to be a quick one. And I'm opening it solely because I think it could be an interesting future episode. But like my vision of what it would look like in the future would potentially require audience participation. So I think I know the answer to this question. Have you guys ever like read or engaged with fanfic for things that you like? Like, or to what degree have you engaged with fanfic?
I have a weird relationship with fanfic too. I beta read a ton of fanfic, even for things that I didn't necessarily watch and consume actively.
Oh, interesting.
So like I had friends who wrote Harry Potter fanfic. That was probably the biggest one. But then also branched into a lot of sci-fi TV. And I feel like this is all vague high school memories now. But I'm pretty sure my friends who wrote fanfic, I would like help read and edit and try and make sure things were in character and things like that mostly for Harry Potter, but also for shows like Battlestar, where I had maybe seen 1 or 2 episodes of, but this was like an extended universe fanfic, and I was just good at writing. So it was like, this is a friend doing an activity. I want to be part of that activity, and I know how to write. So I'm going to be a part of that. And then I read a lot, mostly as like in my downtime almost, like where I didn't have much else to do. This is a very vague, bad answer, but like I think part of the Harry Potter, it was in high school. It was late at night, and it was just like, I need something to do before bed. And so I would just like troll through Harry Potter forums and read like weird pairings, like a lot of Hermione, a lot of like just fluffy, cute fics that would help me fall asleep or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah. But like light past the time type stuff.
Yes. And never like really getting really invested into long fan fiction narratives or anything like that.
I've read Twilight fan fiction, and it was called 50 Shades of Grey. And I've read One Direction fan fiction. It was called After. Outside of that, I think my first introduction to fan fiction was Harry Potter, but it was before I read Harry Potter. And it was a friend in middle school who was trying to convince me to read Harry Potter and was telling me about how, I think this was like the 3rd book was coming out or had come out. So it wasn't even like the full series or was out or anything like that, but she's telling me about her like Harry Potter love, and she sent me a link or shared a link with some fan fiction she wrote that was from the perspective of Draco Malfoy's leather pants. And that introduced me to this whole idea of like fan fiction that was around like inanimate objects and their perspectives in the, like, I was so confused on so many levels that I think that being my first experience with fan fiction was not great, and I just from there like never really went back to that. I'm not a person for whom fan fiction is a thing. I don't think there's anything obviously bad about fan fiction, and I think for the people who enjoy it, that's great, but I'm not that person. And mostly because I don't engage with a lot of bonus material outside of the canon anyway. I'm not like, I love Pride and Prejudice. If you're gonna ask me to read like Mr. Darcy's Diary, I don't care. I don't care. Like, like I'm not that person that needs much outside of the canon to enjoy the media. Even with things that I love, like Firefly. Like Firefly has a ton of comics outside of, and it's something that was tragically short, but I've read maybe one of the comics and I've never felt really, I don't feel like I need to read the other stuff. I just have a really short attention span for media anyway. Like I'll watch a season of a thing and I'll be like, great, that was great. I'm not like, oh, where's season 2? I just kind of pick up and move on. So that's not a great recipe for a fanfic consumer. So it's just never been big on my radar.
Yeah, I think that resonates with me. I think I was more interested in dissecting what was there and like understanding the characters within a space. So like Firefly is a good example. I rewatched that so many times, but like I would rather just rewatch the series than read things where people had taken out those characters and played with them in a sandbox. I was just more interested in understanding everything that was there than what was generated besides that. But I also did read the comics and things like that. So anything that was within canon, I was interested in, but not what fandom and fans were generating for some reason. I don't know. I like totally respect and admire people who do that, but it was just not something that I was super interested in.
I am also in the low fanfic consumption, but like fanfic was never a huge part of my like fandom participation. It was definitely something that was always kind of there on the periphery. I like, again, because my like adolescent fandom stuff was mostly bands, and I have always found like fanfic of real life people slightly off-putting. Like I don't think it's an inherently bad thing, but that's a separate conversation that like that's not my jam. I'm gonna leave it at that. and so like that, I did never get super into that fanfic. I was briefly a Twilight fan, so I definitely read some Twilight fanfic, which was better than Twilight, unsurprisingly. I think that is like an interesting one too, where it was like people were like, yeah, like here's like a world, and then like we're gonna go do other things with it, because it's not. I was about to say it's sort of inevitable that you'll improve upon it, but like 50 Shades exists, so
You would think.
you would think, whatever. So yes, like I feel like probably I'm also like low fanfic consumption, maybe similar to Sari, I guess, in terms of how much. But I brought this up because I thought that something that might be fun to do in the future is an episode on fanfic, but like because we don't have a ton of experience with fanfic, between us and whatnot, and like I think I don't know, there's a lot of things to talk about in terms of like what fanfic is and what it's doing and whatever. And so I thought that something that might be kind of neat is to have maybe people in the audience recommend to us fanfic for things that we have talked about on the podcast.
Oh, I would love that.
I would love that too. I would love to read some, especially for a purpose of like.
Yes, I would totally do that.
Yeah. Like, I haven't read much fanfic. Please rec me some, and then.
Okay.
I mean,
I'm so on board. I'm so excited for the recs that we don't have yet.
Great. Well, okay. So yeah, I don't know. So find us on Twitter or on the site. I guess this is a good time for Mario to do the outro business then.
if you guys have some of those recommendations for us, we would love to hear them. Additionally, we would love to hear all of your thoughts about fandoms, especially if they were more coherent than mine. I mean, please come teach us more. Come share with us. You can find us at SnarkSquad.com, where there will be a post dedicated to this episode. We'll also have our media list, so the things that we'll be covering in upcoming episodes. If you want to read or watch along with us, you can also.
That post is probably the best place to like dump the fanfic recommendations. They'll be like consolidated.
Yeah, put them in the comments for us so we can find them all in one place. You can also find us for more fandom feelings at Snark_squad on Twitter. You can find me at My Name is Marines.
I am at Sweeney Says.
I am at CE Riley.
Thanks to Sari for joining us again and for being such a regular. And thank you to Stefan Chin for our fancy theme music, which is playing us out right now. We will catch you again on the next episode. Bye.
Bye.